Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to the Planning Commission podcast. Today's episode, Save the Clock Tower, Save the Clock Tower, with our guest, Sara Bronin, Chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation.
The Planning Commission podcast is a spirited discussion with myself and a couple of my longtime colleagues in the profession. Our discussions are based solely on our own opinions and do not reflect the opinions or views of our employers, the American Planning Association, or even our alma maters. So grab a seat in the back of City Hall, dig out an old copy of Robert's Rules, and for goodness sakes, read your packet. The Planning Commission is now in session.
All right, let's take roll call. Commissioner Smith.
Here.
Commissioner Kostelik.
Aye, aye, sir.
Welcome back. And myself, Commissioner Danley. We're here. Our agenda today, discussion item, whiskey pairing, our interview, and the lightning round. So, commissioners, can I get a motion to approve?
Yes, so moved.
Yeah, second.
A little faster on your feet, commissioners. Let's go wake up, get some coffee in there. There we go.
Okay.
All right. So to our listeners, just a quick reminder, please do us a favor, hit up the website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. Go to YouTube, Amazon, Apple, Spotify, all the places. Subscribe, like, give us some feedback. We love your feedback. All right. So I want to make sure our discussion item is hit. Historic preservation. Holy cow. This is a pretty good one, man. I served on the historic preservation committee here in our county and got a chance to provide some feedback, and we deal with it on the P&Z commission all the time, or pretty regularly. So I think it means a lot to us, right? It certainly should. I think we as planners respect and admire a lot of our historic structures. And so I'm going to ask you a quick question before we get to the whiskey pairing. I would like for you to share a time when a historic building or a place really moved you emotionally, right? When did you walk into a place or see a place for the first time that really was historic and just, man, it was overwhelming, or you definitely left with such an incredible feeling that you don't normally get from going to the mall, right? I mean, it's a different place. So either of you got something, I got one, but either give you a chance first.
You know, I sure do. I just, as soon as you asked that, I was thinking about, and this is just from tiny little kid Jess, when I grew up in North Carolina and in a town called Sawmills was our town. And then there was the little town next door where my grandparents lived called Hudson. And my Papa Henry was the high school principal there for a long time. And so there's a special place in my heart for Hudson, and it's got kind of this cute little downtown area. And it has a historic place called Windmill Park and Hudson Railroad Depot Museum. And it's where up until the 1970s, there was a railroad depot there, about the same time that we stopped having Amtrak, not Amtrak, but Greyhound buses and things. So
Yeah.
it's just it was this, it's just this beautiful place. And when I was a kid, we used to go over there, and they do outdoor concerts in the summertime.
Oh, yeah.
So it's just kind of a sweet nostalgic thing. And I was thinking about it, and I thought, I think that's a historic spot. So that's the one I picked.
I mean, for me, it's bigger. My early days of both political science and journalism, the Eisenhower Executive Office building next to the White House has just always been one that the intricacy of the design, the scale, the prominence of where it sits, and really of kind of being the political and policy nerd of really where a lot of the stuff I tend to think, I guess, actually happens there. So that building to me just is one, whenever I go to DC, I just go to and kind of glare at and look at and take it in and try to notice different things.
Yeah. And I tell you, for any planner who's not been to DC, that's a place you got to go, right? I mean, it's just incredible. We all know the 3 or 4, 5, 10, whatever it is, things that we are on the go-to, but for every one of those, there's 3 or 4 more other places that we don't often hear about, and it is such an incredible place. And as a planner, thinking about the master plan that went into DC, and then of course the structures and buildings and everything, the architecture, it's as good as it gets for our country. I suspect, I don't know. My place, man, I got a chance when I was a kid to go into Independence Hall. And it didn't hit me, the gravity of it, quite yet. So that's definitely on my top of my list. But there's one other one I'm going to share that truly did move me. And it actually ended up being a church. And it was a church in St. Augustine, Florida, the first Catholic cathedral, I believe.
Mhm.
And honestly, it was so funny, man. I was with my grandma and my mom, and my grandma, who's a devoted Catholic, she's like, let's go in here. And I didn't know where we were because it was at ground level. And it didn't just register to me that this was a cathedral. All right, cool. I thought we were just doing the historic thing, right? And touring around. And so I go inside, and the next thing I know, I'm like, holy moly, right? Literally, it was just like the stained glass and the wood and the grandeur of this building that had been there for hundreds of years. I mean, our first sort of true community, if you will, St. Augustine, Florida. And I was overwhelmed, man. It broke me for a minute. I literally had some, tears moved, into my eyes. It was intense. And I just thought, holy cow, it was really remarkable moment for me. And that the architecture and the feel of that building, and then of course I'm guessing some religious part of it, all hit me at once. So it was a pretty cool experience. So,
and those places amaze me. And I guess if we look at the
Yeah.
three of us, two of us are in Idaho, one of us is in Alaska, and at least in terms of Western white settlement in the US,
Yeah.
when we see something that's historic in one of our places and think about St. Augustine and Charleston and New Orleans,
yeah.
and then even just thinking back to what happened with Notre Dame Cathedral a few years ago, the fact that something has weathered that long between and St. Augustine, not just the human threats of fire and all the other stuff, but of hurricanes and floods and everything else, that's pretty spectacular.
Yeah. All right. So before we turn attention to Sara Bronin, the chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, let's go to our whiskey pairing for Save the Clock Tower. Save the Clock Tower. Dawn.
I should have
Hopefully
gone
our
with
audience
like
gets that reference.
I should have
Some of
gone
them
with
will.
like a Northern Irish whiskey, because that's where the DeLorean manufacturing plant was.
Good call. Good call.
No, I'm going to go with a bourbon that is distilled on the site of a national historic landmark and a historic district. It was originally the Oscar Old Pepper distillery in the 1800s, and then the Labrador and Graham distillery. And if Prohibition killed so many distilleries and destruction of that, and so very few have weathered through that. But now Woodford Reserve is in that place, and certainly not only just a smooth whiskey, but one that, for today's topic of historic preservation, so many of those distilleries that do have some historic prevalence to them are in great shape. Woodford's one of those. Four Roses is another Maker's Mark. But yes, and not only that, this one's the double oaked. Yummy. It's like a caramel candy bar of bourbon in your mouth.
It's heavenly, no doubt about that. So very good. All right. So let's turn our attention to our interview with Sara Bronin. We would like to take a quick moment to thank our friends at Plan Edison for supporting today's podcast. Looking to sharpen your urban planning skills and advance your planning career? Plan Edison courses offer 300 courses on cutting-edge planning topics and skills, such as parking reform, missing middle housing, equity analysis, and climate resilience. Visit courses.planedison.com/PC10 to take advantage of an exclusive offer for Planning Commission podcast listeners. All right, Sara Bronin, Chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Thanks for joining us. First, if you wouldn't mind, Sara, can you just give us a little bit of a background of yourself and tell us a little bit about the council?
Great. So I'm Sara. My day job normally is as a professor at Cornell University. I have a license in architecture and a license as an attorney. So I kind of bridge the worlds between architecture and law and urban planning, all of which I teach at Cornell. I came to the council in January 2023 as its chair, having gone through a nomination and confirmation process. And the council itself, the full name, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, is the federal historic preservation agency that is intended to advise the president and Congress on historic preservation policy. So through that, we issue guidance and policy. We write letters to Congress and talk with our fellow federal agencies about how they can better incorporate historic places into their planning and into their projects.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Sarah. Sarah, one thing I'd really like to hear from you is a short history of how historic preservation in the U.S. and how the ACHP assists in that, and kind of how that works. Some of our listeners are new planners, and we love to give them sort of a brief overview of what it is that your whole organization is there for.
Yeah, so as a federal agency, the Advisory Council focuses primarily on federal projects. So many of the planners out there in the audience might be focused on local projects or interactions between state and local governments. Our purview primarily relates to federal agencies, federal projects, federal programs, and also those private projects that are receiving federal permits. So as a planner, you might be engaged in our work if you're at the local level through your local government. Many local governments are what we call certified local governments. And what that means is they can participate, they can have a formal participating role in these processes that we've established to help review federal agencies, projects, and licenses and permits for their ability to take into account historic resources. So we engage local governments and we engage state historic preservation offices too. That might be an entry point in for the planners in the audience. For that sort of global review process, that's dubbed the Section 106 process, named after the provision in the National Historic Preservation Act passed in the 1960s that established the Advisory Council and the National Register of Historic Places and a lot of our federal historic preservation framework. Through that process, we engage as well as state and local governments, tribal governments, through government to government consultation anytime a federal project affects either tribal lands or tribal resources, and this is pretty broadly defined. So I guess how folks engage with the agency is really through these different avenues.
Well, Sarah, I think I've been waiting a while to have you on, and in that time you shifted jobs and are now a presidential appointee. So I love having you on from that standpoint. But how do you meld, I think back to some of your previous work and the zoning mapping and stuff you've done? How do we meld those things, the planning, the zoning, the historic preservation, when we're in the nitty-gritty throes of a comprehensive plan or a zoning ordinance?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So my prior life in public service, I guess, was a volunteer commissioner chairing the Hartford City Planning and Zoning Commission for 7 years. And then I worked with a state group here, helped to organize a state group of nonprofits tackling zoning reform at the state level in Connecticut. So zoning to me is really another, along with historic preservation, zoning is a really fundamental way that in which we use the law to order our cities and to dictate what gets built. So with that background, I guess your question is really about how zoning and preservation interplay. I mean, is that where you want for me to go with that? Okay.
Yeah, just thinking how we're bridging these things. We'll follow up too with some questions related to like housing affordability and other stuff. And just what's this intertwinement, I guess, that's happening there?
Yeah, so some zoning codes have historic preservation regulations embedded in the zoning codes. So they, at the local level, have decided not to do a standalone historic commission, but to embed it into zoning itself. That they're also at the local level where zoning is adopted, of course, standalone historic commissions that have design review processes that look at typically the exterior of buildings and the facade of buildings, and consider whether proposed changes are compatible with what's around them. Now, zoning focuses on what happens inside, the uses of the building. Preservation focuses primarily on the exterior and on the aesthetics. but they interplay both through local processes, which might say, okay, you go to historic first, you go to zoning first, or, and they work that out at the local level. But they also interplay, I would say, philosophically, in that, both of them have both types of regulations have a role to play in dictating what we see and how we experience our communities. So even where zoning is not regulating expressly and distinctly regulating historic properties different from non-historic properties, you still see zoning playing a role, for example, through form-based codes to ensure the production of new construction that's compatible with the old. So where a historic commission is looking at compatibility from a design standpoint, the zoning code might have that same priority, but just manifest in different ways for new construction, and irregardless of whether a property is part of a historic district or not. So there's a lot of different ways those two regimes work together at the local level.
Thanks for serving on the planning commission as well. It's something that I do, and I know it's a thankless job. I don't know if maybe they gave you a sandwich or something for your efforts. Hopefully they reimbursed you well.
It's an unpaid public service.
Yep. It's what we do, right? It's how we lend our own expertise back to the places that we love. So Sarah, if you can, I just would love for you to touch on just sort of what has the U.S. learned with respect to historic preservation, the pros, cons, how we can do this better, and also, the impacts of urban renewal efforts in both past and present.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the historic preservation legal regime on the national level and at the state and local levels too is always evolving to respond to new challenges, new ideas in planning and in community building. So, I guess you might say, if you go back to the dawn of the preservation movement, it really started off as a movement with that was focused on the buildings associated with prominent men in particular. So the founding fathers, and Mount Vernon being one of the first historically preserved sites that got attention by a lot of people as an example of historic preservation.
And I think there was a distillery on that site too, which plays well with our whiskey theme on the podcast. So anyway, go ahead.
There you go. That's not a focus of my personal research, the whiskey focus. So you'll have to add to that. But over time we evolved to in preservation to say, well, preservation is more than just about, let's say, the founding fathers. It's also about the communities that have evolved over time. It's about people who might not have been the wealthiest members of their communities. It's about women. It's about diverse groups. And so because of that greater understanding of what preservation could be, the law has evolved with that. And so we recognize things like historic districts full of buildings. We in the federal government recognize concepts like traditional cultural properties, which are not buildings at all, which are, I guess, a more conceptual approach than the bricks and mortar architectural value type discussions that we might have been having that might have predominated preservation 50 years ago. We also see the incorporation of tribal knowledge, indigenous knowledge, which is, I would say, one of the hot topics in preservation right now, at least at the federal level. How do we know that something is significant? Do we rely only on textbooks and people with doctoral degrees, or do we actually rely on people with lived experience and known and knowledge about their communities? So there's always an evolution in terms of how we think about preservation and whether it's the topic of the sites that are worth preserving, or the question of how do we know how we should preserve and what we should preserve. I think all of these have been core to preservationists' inquiries about their own field from the beginning.
Yeah, Sarah, you were talking about the some of the tribal historic sites and things like that. I actually live in Alaska, and that is something that we're such a new place in the world of tracking that types of things, because our history is still happening, and so it's so interesting to hear that. And I'm experiencing projects right now where trying to pull that data and figure out what is, has already been designated as historically significant in a river community, for example, is very different than what I was used to when I worked in urban areas where, we're looking at buildings, right? Like you said, that were named after people. So one of the things I'm thinking about as I move from like that idea of what is significant to the things that have already been designated as historic, and I'm thinking about a lot in like urban neighborhood environments. How do we kind of balance that historic preservation with key planning things that are out there right now, like housing affordability and equity? We have neighborhoods where those historic places, boy, those neighborhoods are pricey, right? In some cities. So how do we balance the need to really preserve those historic elements and also leap into those areas where we're challenged with housing affordability and equity?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's my view, and I think if you look across the preservation field as a whole, that preservation and affordable housing go hand in hand. It's often far less expensive to rehabilitate a unit of housing in an existing building than it is to build from scratch. And that's true in high-cost markets and low-cost markets alike.
Yeah.
You, though, point out something really important, which is that sometimes when you have a historic designation, especially in an area where there is single family housing only, you see a correlating high property value, and whether it's causal, so whether it's the preservation designation leads to high property values, or whether it's simply that people with high property values see the value of preservation and want to lock, in their in some ways through preservation. We don't have a good sense of that yet, because there has not been enough research on that. But for sure, there's been a lot of research on the correlation between designation and high property values in single family areas in particular. So I guess, those questions deserve further study for sure. So how do we make sure that it's not causal, that designation doesn't lead to out of control prices? And I think part of the answer to that, or part of the way we can address that, is not only through the tried and true ways to promote affordable housing, so subsidies and vouchers and the financial incentives for that, but also through zoning. So zoning is a tool that enables people to use a place in lots of different ways. And if we enable people to convert existing buildings to 2-unit, 3-unit, 4-unit, or multi-unit dwellings, that's something that could help. If we're locking the outside in stone, we don't necessarily have to lock the inside in stone. And I should say, by the way, preservation doesn't lock anything in stone. What it does is it mediates the pace of change. So
I'm glad you pointed that out. I think
before I get misquoted,
yes.
That was a shorthand. That was a very shorthand. But I guess my point is that if preservation is really focused on the exterior, there's a lot of different things that can happen in the interior. And in fact, the more flexibility you allow for interior uses, for example, historic mill buildings all over Connecticut, where we've done a lot of work understanding zoning, those are often zoned for industrial development still. And instead, they should be zoned to allow for housing and office and all these other things, because otherwise they don't get converted. They don't get reused, and that's bad for the buildings themselves.
And there's not a ton on the inside of those to maybe even sometimes even have to demo if they're structurally sound. That seems to be maybe a more straightforward conversion than some of our maybe downtown buildings. Is that a correct assumption there?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge with the historic mill buildings is often their environmental remediation issues. So
absolutely.
Just the carelessness and the lack of knowledge that people had 100 years ago, we see a lot of that being a barrier. But if you have funding for that, and states, including Connecticut, provide brownfield funding and remediation funding, you have the opportunity to then imagine a series of new uses for these sites. And so to the extent that historic preservationists can engage in that discussion and can enable more historic places to be reused for housing, which is actually great. Even historic main streets could use more housing. And we see in Connecticut too, where we've done a lot of work on that, that historic main streets are not zoned for housing on the upper stories.
Yeah.
So the people who could be feet on the street for the retail and create a vibrant community are not there because they've been zoned out over in the intervening years. When you have buildings that were built for that purpose, retail on the ground floor, housing on the top, and then that actually got zoned out. So we're actually, I think in many ways, including in zoning, going back to our roots and how we used to develop.
Yeah, I
So-
think an inventory of all the vacant second, third, or even higher in traditional Main Street downtowns would alarm a lot of people. Now, you guys on the Advisory Council of Historic Preservation recently passed a climate change policy, if I remember correctly. Give me a sense of what that entails, even from the standpoint of historic buildings, maybe even down to the tribal concerns you mentioned.
Yeah, so we have not adopted that policy yet. It's in draft.
Okay.
So it's undergoing that process of tribal consultation and consultation with the state historic preservation officers. That is something that we do anytime we adopt policy or guidance. We undergo a consultation process, particularly with tribes. That's set out in our regulations. So the content of that policy focuses on federal agencies and their obligations or opportunities to consider climate change as they consider their inventories of historic properties and as they consider their treatment of historic properties through that Section 106 process that I mentioned. But the policy as drafted is also broader in that it describes ways that state, local, and even tribal governments might also continue to consider climate in their policies. So whether it's through planning, actually that's mentioned, to planning for climate adaptation, planning for climate mitigation, or whether it's through planning or whether it's through funding, whether it's through disaster management policies. Those are increasingly important in an era of changing weather and extreme temperatures and rising precipitation and in the coastal areas, sea level rise and flooding. So we see, opportunities for state and local governments to plan for and mitigate the impacts of and prepare for disasters and disaster management after the fact. So that's what the climate policy covers. We have many communities around the country, Annapolis, Miami, out in Colorado, threatened by wildfires, of course, mudslides in California. We see so many different kinds of manifestations of the physical changing climate. And we don't see a lot of governments that have prepared their communities for those changes. And to the extent that historic places reflect our shared past, or, to some extent our values, we know that many of these places will be lost if we don't change.
Well, when you say historic places, that I kind of meld an idea and think we have some discussions here in Boise over historic preservation that I think are very valid. We've had a tendency to take a historic structure and, let's build something else there, but move it to a park. And it's almost like, here's this Disneyland, Main Street, USA, in a park of historic buildings. But you said in that one, historic place. How do you connect place versus building? And how does that impact something like relocation of historic structures from a climate change perspective?
Yeah, so relocation is actually expressly mentioned in this draft as something that we should actually start considering and writing into the kinds of treatments that are possible for historic, movable historic objects, which includes buildings and structures and objects.
Those mill sites might not be as easy.
You never know. Some of them, so a huge brick, industrial building, maybe not, but you'd be surprised what kinds of places. We've seen huge lighthouses being moved.
That's true. Yeah.
So,
wow.
People are very ingenious when it comes to these things. But you really asked about sort of how do we define historic resources and historic properties. So historic properties is a term that's used in federal law, and it encompasses 5 different types of properties or resources, whatever you want to call them. The first is buildings. That's the most common, what we think of, again, when we think of preservation, a Mount Vernon or a Beacon Hill, or, collection of buildings. But the second one is structures. So historic bridges, for example, are historic roads, roadways. So these are structures that would be encompassed under that resources bigger umbrella. Historic objects. So believe it or not, you can list certain types of shipwrecks on the National Register, which are considered objects because they're not buildings, they're not structures, they're not affixed to the ground, but they can be considered historic and covered by the National Register of Historic Places. You have sites, which encompasses, I guess you might call them cultural landscapes in some cases, tribal sites, archaeological sites. And then the fifth category is districts. So a district is a collection of any of the above. Typically, you'd have a district with buildings, but there's also districts with a mix of structures and buildings. And one example of that I use in my historic preservation law casebook is the Chittenden Locks Dam out in the Pacific Northwest, which is a collection of the locks, the buildings that were used to operate them, and a couple of other things thrown in there. So it's structures, buildings, and an assortment of things.
Well, we're only a couple years away from the 50th anniversary of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, so we're close to that designation, and that might make Gordon Lightfoot happy. So you've been speaking of the 70s, Chris.
Yeah, well, and it's also very timely. I was just doing some work over in the Tacoma area. In fact, for those of you who are watching, this is a flyer that I took back, and you could see Save Parkland School, and this building it's in the background is a very centrally located schoolhouse. And it's like, it's such a challenge, right? Because you're also the cost of trying to bring those things up to modern standards. And it's just such a incredible part of what we do planning wise, keeping our past, making sure we don't forget it, but also making certain that it accommodates our modern needs and uses and such. So in that light, I mean, we're approaching the wonderful 1970s level era architecture that is now eligible potentially for historic preservation. So under that, just thinking about that particular time frame. So what are some of the marquee buildings or other built environment features that we should be preserving in your mind?
From the 1970s era?
Yeah, about then. Is there anything worth saving?
I just think of I went to University of Illinois, Chicago, the 60s, just a brutalist architecture place and meant to be riot free. And it's getting a little bit of a revival and recognition, but I know historically that hasn't necessarily been looked at as, oh, wow, let's preserve this.
Yeah, well, I will say that there are people out there who love the brutalist architecture. There's really excellent examples of rehabilitations of those. And I will mention in New Haven, Connecticut, the Hotel Marcel, a brutalist building that was converted to a net zero hotel designed by Marcel Breuer, a European architect known for that style. That just came online last year and is very cool because it integrates sustainability and preservation. I'll say too that my students have some, apparently the younger generation has brutalist sympathies. I had a great class last semester at Cornell, historic preservation law, and they were really, there's a couple of students in my class who were totally committed to preserving brutalist architecture. And then just last in line with that, there's a group called Docomomo, which is, I don't know what their whole acronym stands for, but there's a lot of O's in it, DOCOMOMO. But it's about, what they try to preserve is about, it is that era of architecture. So the modernist monuments. If somebody out there is interested in that, feel free to check them out. But we see in Washington, D.C., as one example, there was a big controversy over at Christian Scientist Church that was within line of the White House, and local review of that, and whether that should be designated and how that should be treated. Actually, it ended up being able to be demolished for a variety of reasons. But I think this is a question for preservationists today, which is how do we treat these structures that may not be beloved by everybody and may actually have not been built all that well, but they are an example of a kind of architecture that we're not really building now. So is it worth having that group of buildings preserved? And so
I just think of like the 70s subdivision with a split level house and the cul-de-sacs and
Brady Bunch, man, it was iconic.
well, again, those are all like these larger, more iconic community structures, like a church or an office building, or this building that's become a hotel, which was an office building. You see these 50-year-old structures come online, and in some communities like New York City, you have an even shorter window for the threshold for declaring something locally designatable. So in New York City, the window is 30 years. So if your building is 30 years old, it could be eligible for the local landmarks commission designation.
Wow, that's the 1990s now. Now that makes me feel really old.
I'm starting to become a historical cultural site myself. Well, listen, before we just want to finish up with our very serious questions, and this has been really fascinating, Sarah. Thank you for being here with us today. So before we run into that lightning round where we're going to ask you with some fun questions and you got to think on your feet, I would like to know, when did it really sink in when you got that presidential nominee appointee? I'm sorry, I'm saying it all wrong. The presidential appointee. I mean, how was that for you? How'd that feel?
It was totally amazing, totally cool.
Yes.
So the way it works is that you get nominated and by the president, by the White House, and there's a process. Actually, before you get nominated, you have to give them information about yourself. Have you ever done anything embarrassing? You see a little bit about your financials. I hoped I came out clean on the other side, so that's good. But they do vet, that before you're announced, of course. And then you go through another series of checks and fingerprinting and interviews and so they showed up to my law school campus and interviewed a random student about me.
Oh, wow.
Oh my gosh.
As one example that, when they do background checks, they have to check, all of these different facets of your life and make sure that, nothing is awry. But fortunately, I'm very boring. But they do that process, and then you go through that Senate. You wait for the Senate to call your name and to vote on you. And I waited for some months because although I think historic preservation is the federal government's top priority, we did have the ambassador to Ukraine and some of the other priorities underway. And so finally, it was great to get confirmed, voted by the Senate, unanimous consent, which is a really good feeling. And then was able to get to work. So it was awesome. And I think, it's amazing that we have this process, and it makes it even more of an honor to have gotten into the role and to serve in this way.
We don't get that in the how the bill becomes a law civics lesson that we all have. We never cover the appointment side of things and the other stuff. So it's always fascinating.
It's pretty niche. I mean, there's not that many appointees every year in any presidential administration that go through the Senate confirmation process. And so it's not something that you would probably normally need to know in your AP civics class or in middle school civics either.
That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a song about it. Let's just make sure that that's true.
After school special.
Yeah. I love it.
About that.
Well, Sarah, we're going to just transition real quick to the lightning round and just some little quick questions for a few minutes. And then I know you're going to get going. You got a lot of big things on your plate, much bigger than the three of us, that's for sure. So if we can, I'm just going to ask you a couple quick questions here. Next vacation.
The fact that I don't have an answer to you.
Oh
no! Right?
Okay.
Next long weekend.
In August, our family is planning to go to Wyoming. So
there you go.
But I don't think that's going to be the next vacation. Oh, actually, you know what? I think I'm going to Oxford in June. There, super historic,
Oh,
my
nice.
alma mater, going for a.
Perfect.
Well,
But
that's
yeah, I
cute.
think
Scholar
definitely the
review.
first Rhodes Scholar we've interviewed on the
Yeah.
podcast as well. So you're checking a
a-
lot of those marquee boxes for
It's
us.
Well,
the
and
120th reunion, so that's
Oh, wow.
that's my next
the
vacation.
Oxford campus is much like what you're going to see in Cheyenne. So, it's pretty duplicative.
It is
Um,
our favorite type of comma, though. So give them our regards for.
I support that
Right.
100%.
We are being very American right now. Can you guys
right.
just get it together here?
favorite 80s sitcom.
Oh, the Golden Girls,
Of
Oh,
course. Thank you.
Yeah,
obviously.
yeah.
Thank you for being a friend. Here we
Thank you
are.
for being a friend. That's right.
So when you talk about your family, your husband is the mayor of Hartford, Connecticut.
Yeah.
What are those dinner table conversations like?
Well, they were a lot more interesting when I was serving on the planning commission. I had been appointed by his predecessor, so he couldn't remove me for a good chunk of time there. So that was it's really interesting, especially having worked at the local level. I was served on the historic commission before the planning commission. So I was very actively involved in the civic life, and of course he has been as well. And I think just getting to know a city and really giving your very best to it, like he has done, and like I've tried to do in my smaller, more limited way in the built environment capacity. I think it's something that you can't. It's something you can't put into words. It's just it's a good feeling to have participated in your community in the way that he has, and and again to a lesser extent the way that I have. And I think those dinner conversations are always about what more can we do.
Well, I just know in tracking you and interacting with you on Twitter over the years that they're doing a lot of things in Hartford, from the parking requirements and lots of other things. So kudos to everyone involved with that. Jess, you got a lightning round question?
I sure do. I need to know, History Channel or historical fiction? What's your preference?
We actually don't have a TV, so I guess I'm gonna have to go with historic. And we have a TV. I'm sorry, we don't have cable. So
Who has cable anymore?
but I don't think I have the History Channel. Although last night
no.
I did watch a Netflix documentary with my daughter about the discovery of the Saqqara tomb in Egypt. And yes, she is
Ooh.
9 years old, and she chose this. I don't know. This is a family trait here. So
That's that dinner conversation influence right there.
That was pretty interesting. But yeah, I guess I'll go with Netflix then.
Well, Jess,
Perfect.
Jess, History Channel, it's just pawn shops and ancient aliens anymore.
I
So
know.
I don't know that there's a
Yeah,
relevance.
auctions.
Like I said, historical fiction or
So
it's so funny. I found out the other day there is an Alaska logger show that's on the History Channel. And I was like, what has that got to do with history? But here we are.
There's a really good fishing show that takes place in Alaska.
There it
Hold on,
is.
it's called The
We have-
Deadliest Catch.
Yeah, you bet. One of my girlfriends lives out there.
My son has seen every episode of that. So whatever
Yeah.
channel that's on, we have that channel.
Discovery,
So,
I think.
I grew up, especially in high school, eating a lot of Taco Bell when it was cheap. I have this motivation to go get a 1970s Taco Bell on the historic registry. What's the first step I make in doing that?
The fast food venues have been placed on various registers because they have an architectural style, and they're iconic, and they are emblematic of
Very.
of our American experience. So it's not too far afield your question. So how would you go about doing it? Well, you'd have to show that it has architectural significance, that it was associated with a significant person, such as yourself, a significant event, possibly, or that it has some prehistoric or historic informational value. Those are the typical criteria. That's on the National Register. Local governments sometimes add new criteria, so to allow more properties to be listed, and states do too sometimes. But those are the main four criteria. So you'd have to pick one of those. It might be the architectural one.
I'm still logging for that 59-cent Mexi Melt to come back. But speaking of history, that's what
Oh,
that
God,
is.
you've got to get better
Preservation law.
taste than that. Jeez
We
almighty.
can't take you anywhere.
Oh, that's
I don't think preservation law governs pricing, but I'll look into that. Maybe a
No,
new
that's
federal,
what
maybe a
they
new
can.
federal policy on that point.
They can do that on the day it's designated. Do like 1970s prices on things. That might be a marketing tactic.
preservation of a really bad recipe. How about that? I mean, good heavens. Sarah, I got one last question and then we're going to wrap up. I imagine that your weeks and months are littered with all kinds of DC cocktail parties and that sort of thing that you're invited to. I'm just curious, you got a go-to cocktail?
Actually, believe it or not, I have started this 2023 going with mocktails.
There you go.
Love it. The zero proof.
But before this, just attempt to try to get on a healthy track. My favorite drink is probably Trudy's Mexican martini in Austin, Texas.
There you go.
Bar, and it's so good. And I don't know what's in there. I'm sure the recipe is available, but every time I go back there, they have these 3 perfect olives, and then that's a really good drink. I'm Mexican American, so I got to go with a margarita type drink, and that's exactly what this is.
Oh, and Don asked on our behalf a question about Taco Bell. Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I'll just apologize on
That,
his
but I
behalf.
did work at my grandparents' Mexican restaurant for my entire childhood. So the Taco Bell comparison, it was especially funny.
A little piece of you died. I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
I'm
Well,
glad you think it's
Well,
funny.
I love this conversation though. I loved it. I think it was great. I
Yeah.
really appreciate you guys having me on.
Sarah, thank you for joining us. We certainly appreciate it. It's been everything we could ask for. Historic preservation is such an incredible part of what we think about and do as planners. Maybe think about it more and more. And your interview today has certainly helped bring more of that to light. So we appreciate your time. So to our listeners, make sure you go to the website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. Do us a favor, like, subscribe, all those wonderful things. Hit up YouTube, Instagram, all the places we're available, and we'll keep doing our thing. We appreciate it. Commissioners, I need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All right. Thank you all. Appreciate your time. Sarah, have yourself a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Commissioner Danley here. Would you like to see more, hear more? Well, we got you covered. Go to our website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. It's got everything you want. Guests, yep, past episodes, video, the audio, even our whiskey pairing, links to everything about all the people we've had on, books, websites, you name it. It's unbelievable. You want to reach out to us? Please. We'd be more than happy to chat. You can email us, planningcommissionpodcast@gmail.com. You want to tweet at us? Go for it, @planningcommish. We're also on YouTube with the Planning Commission Podcast channel, Facebook. Heck, send us a carrier pigeon if you need to. We'd love to hear from you about ideas, guests, you name it. Thank you for listening. We appreciate it. We'll keep doing our thing. You keep doing yours. Have a good one.